I didn't have any really organized thoughts for what it was I wanted to say tonight. I mean, I came in thinking, okay, I want to talk about not being nostalgic. That was the main thing. I was like, let's not be nostalgic. That neighborhoods and cities have their life cycles. Identities, you know, are historical constructs in and of themselves. So, you know, it's like who we are, categories that we organize our own lives and desires through, like those change, our neighborhoods are going to change. And that, you know, we shouldn't hold on in some kind of nostalgic way to what gay neighborhoods have been in the past. I kind of look with horror in some way at the city of Chicago, where they have what I think of as, I call them the ethnic Disneylands. That it's like their little neighborhoods. That it's like, oh, that's the Ukrainian neighborhood, or you know, this is the the Polish neighborhood, and that the neighborhoods have kind of gotten these kind of like official designations as what kind of neighborhood they are. And there's the gay neighborhood with the rainbow pylons going down the middle of Halsted Street. And I just thought, I don't want. Once a neighborhood stops kind of being organically what it is by the people who live there, then you know you shouldn't try and force the matter. And that I really love the way that cities are layered and sedimented with different strata of things that they have been. And you know, for me, one of the pleasures of being in a city is like, and being a historian of a city is it's like, oh yeah, you know, it's like that building, you know, that came from like this time period when this neighborhood was like that. And, you know, there's a pleasure to seeing the layers. So, you know, I thought, okay, queer neighborhoods are good, but, you know, let's not be nostalgic, and let's think about what queer neighborhoods, you know, are in the future. That's why I'm on this panel. Not what have they been, but what will they be? The other thing I had thought to talk about is that one of my critical interests right now in studying sexuality in urban spaces is to really think about what I think of as like the circulation between like bodily practices and built environments. That it's like our neighborhoods make us who we are, you know, the habits that we have. In the case of transsexuality, which is what I specifically study, it's like I really think that quite literally, it's like bodies as built environments, and that bodies as built environments that are informed by the other kinds of ways we build the environments that we occupy. So I was thinking, well, maybe I should talk some about, you know, bodies and spaces, and maybe make it personal. And I was struck by listening to everybody else on the panel essentially talk about queer neighborhoods and tell a personal story about where they were, like who they were, what kind of neighborhood they wanted to live in, what their history with the city has been. And it struck me that one of the other things I was going to say was I wanted to talk about diaspora and, you know, moving out of spaces. And then thinking about my own story, listening to everyone else, was realizing how comfortable, or familiar at least, if not comfortable, how familiar I feel with the idea of diaspora. That I grew up in a military family. Like on the social networking pages that I use on the internet, it says like hometown, I always write globally deployed. Because I grew up, you know. Where am I from? I know where I was conceived. I know where I was born. Where am I from? I don't know. I'm from a moment in U.S. Cold War history. You know, that's where I'm from. So anyway, so I grew up in a military family. I also grew up on my mother's side of the family in this really like tiny, weird little church. There were maybe like 100,000 people who belonged to it worldwide. And so when we were traveling around, living on different army bases, there would be these people that, you know, on my mother's side of the family, we would know because they were members of the church. And, you know, it'd be like meeting in people's homes to have these little church services or something. And it's like I never met them before in my life, but they were family, you know. And that sense of, I belong to a community of people who are very globally deployed, and there's not very many of them, and the people that I identify with, or am told that I identify with, are not necessarily the people that I share, you know, my school classrooms with, or shop at the same grocery store with, or, you know, live on the same street as. And so for me, like, a sense of community has always been something that doesn't necessarily map to a geographical space in a really clear and direct way. Community and neighborhood are not the same thing at all. being transsexual. You know, again, it's like a minority within a minority within a minority, you know, in some sense, if you think about it in the LGBT rubric. You know, most of the people in queer space are not people who share that identity with me. So even in queer space, I tend to be with people who are not like me. And so again, like even these things that I hear other people talking about as being like, oh, you know, this is my community, this is, you know, where I live, these are the people who are like me, my kind. It's like, well, you know, not for me. There isn't really a transsexual community, and that, you know, never has been in that kind of geographical sense, except in the Tenderloin. And there we are actually talking about a ghetto in a quite literal sense. You know, we're talking about a part of the city that was structured and, you know, policed as a sex work ghetto, a vice district, the place where you buy drugs, where you go to gamble, you know, where you live when you're on parole. That it's the, I mean, it was quite, you know, you can look at the maps of the Central City Police District, and like that is where the Tenderloin used to be. It's like it wasn't just people migrated there. It's like that's where they were policed into. You know, that it was, you know, certain kinds of deviant populations were literally concentrated in that Tenderloin and segregated from the rest of the city. And for a lot of people, the Tenderloin was, you know, they used to call them like, one of the cute words, like resorts for sex perverts, you know, the one that I heard. But it was the place that was, there were like leisure and pleasure cultures in the Tenderloin. People would go to bars, to after-hours clubs. It's where the gay bars were. It's where the bookie joints were. It's where the houses of prostitution were. But most people who went in to do those kinds of activities left once they were through doing those kinds of activities. It was a tourist destination of sorts. I mean, for people who lived in the city as well as people who came to San Francisco because it was a wide open town. But for transgender people, the Tenderloin became a residential ghetto. I mean, because of employment discrimination, not being rented to in other parts of the city, because of employment discrimination, not having work other than survival prostitution, because the police would literally say, you're not supposed to be on this street, you're supposed to be in the Tenderloin, get over there, that this kind of, you know, red light district became a residential ghetto for trans people. You know, I think there was a real sense of trans community that developed in the Tenderloin in 40s, 50s, 60s, if not earlier. I think it's great that the need for that kind of community no longer exists, because it was you know, it was like surviving the oppression of the place, and that, you know, you can trace this diaspora, a transgender diaspora, out of the Tenderloin. I mean, once surgical and hormonal change of sex became possible in San Francisco in the mid-1960s, once people could change their names, get new state-issued IDs, get, you know, different kinds of work. That also starts in the mid-1960s, and you can see people, you know, literally, you know, moving out of trans people moving out of the Tenderloin. So, you know, it's like I don't want to romanticize what communities of geographical proximity can be. It's like as important as they are in some ways, that I think it's not the be-all, end-all.